In this recording, I'm going to show you how to do a data-driven threat hunt using ThreatQ. This is a completed example of the threat hunt, and you can see we start out with a CrowdStrike intelligence report, which looks like this. We then look at the indicators and its associated attributes, any events that are associated with it, in this case a Splunk sighting, any related indicators. Then we move on to adversary association and start to look at MITRE ATT&CK data. Using this MITRE ATT&CK data, we can start to look at techniques, the related information associated with those techniques, mitigations, and then finally come up with a set of actions that we can take in order to help remediate any potential threats. Let's start out by using a partially filled investigation. So I've pre-added the CrowdStrike intelligence report file, and I've also chosen a particular IP address that is associated to that report. The first thing you'll notice is we have two different sources. We've got threat intelligence from both CrowdStrike and FireEye. You'll also notice that we have a score of 7. ThreatQ's scoring system allows us to prioritize the threat data based upon parameters that we set. For example, I can focus on specific attributes, sources, and various other criteria as well to help focus that threat data to something that's relevant to me. Firstly, I'm going to run an operation. These operations help us understand a little bit more about the particular thing that we're looking at, and they're contextually sensitive. So you can see here, for example, that if I click on virus total, I get some information back about this particular IP. I can also run searches against internal systems, in this case the SIM, and see if I've spotted this IP there too. Let's look at some of the attributes associated with this IP. As we scroll down here, we can see that we've got some confidence information, there's an associated malware family, and other information as well. I've added a few in here. The next thing we're going to do is look at any associated events. And in this case, we can see we've got a Splunk sighting. Now, if I add this Splunk sighting into the investigation, you'll notice that the node appears here, and we're provided with some information about the Splunk sighting itself. And if we click this little icon at the top here, we can drill into that Splunk sighting for more details. Going back to the original indicator here, we can also look for other information too. So let's start out with related indicators. So as I look through the list of related indicators here, at the top I can see I've got a CVE. Let's add that into the investigation. Once the indicator is added into the investigation, we can then start to look at the information associated with this particular indicator. Notice here the sources are different. We've got some information from Digital Shadows and also from FireEye too. Now, as we did previously, I'm now going to run an operation against this particular indicator. Notice that the operations have changed as the indicator type has changed. So in this case, we're looking at a CVE, so we have the opportunity to run a check against our vulnerability assessment tooling to see if we're vulnerable to this particular CVE. Here, we can see that we are. So the next step is to create a task which allows us to patch this CVE, and we're going to assign that to our vulnerability management team. So to create a task, I add in the name. I assign it to a particular member of the team. I can also add in due dates, priorities, associated objects, and even add a description for the vulnerability assessment team. So when I hit save, that task is created and will appear on the queue of the vulnerability assessment or management team. Let's go back to the original indicator here. Now as I zoom in and look on the right hand side here, you can see we've got some adversary association. Now in this case, we've got two adversaries that are tied to this particular IP. Rather than adding them in manually, what I'm going to do is add them both into the investigation at the same time. There we are. So here you can see that both adversaries have been added into the investigation, and we can now start to look at the adversary information. At this point, we start to look at slightly different information from a different perspective. So we're going to bring in the MITRE ATT&CK data here to help us understand a little bit more about this particular adversary. So if I click on attributes here, we can see all of the different information within the system that we have, not just from MITRE ATT&CK, but from our threat intelligence sources and also from our open source feeds as well. The second thing you'll notice is we have attack patterns in here. This is MITRE ATT&CK data, and it allows us to look at the techniques that these particular adversaries employ to help us understand how to build better mitigations. So let me add in one of technique for an example, data from removable media. Now when I add in the technique, you'll notice down the right hand side we have a description. We also have additional attributes and other information for us to look at. Let's look at some of those attributes. First of all, we'll add in the platform attributes. So let's add those three in. So we can see that this particular technique targets Windows, macOS, and Linux. The next thing we're going to look at is the malware. Is there any malware tied to this particular technique that is of interest to us? So there's several different types here, but for the purposes of this demonstration, I'm going to add in USB stealer. Now the first thing you'll notice here is when I add in the malware, not only does it relate to the original technique, but it also relates back to the adversary that it's associated with. We have a description of the malware. We also have attribute information, including websites that we can go to read more about the malware and ultimately any mitigation techniques that we may wish to employ. Going back to the technique here, we can now look down and see that we have courses of action. So these are the mitigations that we could deploy in order to help protect ourselves against this particular technique. This allows us not only to be reactive, but also allows us to be proactive too in the way in which we deal with potential threats. So again, you'll notice down the right hand side we have a description. We also have some attributes, and if I add in a couple of these, you'll see that we have some URLs here that we can go and visit to get some more information about how to deploy or develop this mitigation. So at this point, I now have my mitigation in place. The next step is for me to create a task so that we get that mitigation applied to our systems. So let's create a task here and apply that. As previously, I can assign it to a specific member of the team, give it a due date, priority, and also a description. In this recording, you can see how we've started out with a file. We've looked at the contents of that file and any related indicators, pulled out some related information. We've also looked at whether or not those related indicators are applicable to our internal environment, seen any additional related indicators that may be of interest and taken action accordingly. From there, we've moved into the understanding of adversary attribution. We've looked at any associated pieces of malware, and we've also leveraged MITRE ATT&CK data to understand the techniques and the mitigations that we can use to help protect us against that potential threat. This allows us to be both proactive and reactive in the way that we deal with potential threats.